was a product manager at a logistics product facing a fixed regulatory deadline. For weeks before the deadline, regulators clarified that audit evidence had to be retained at event level, not summary level. I needed to protect customers and the operation while personally demonstrating delivery under pressure, making a defensible decision and leaving a repeatable mechanism rather than a one-off recovery. I mapped the minimum compliant outcome, separated mandatory evidence from optional analytics, and cut 2 planned interface improvements. I aligned legal, engineering, and pilot customers on one critical path, reassigned 3 engineers, and established daily decision checkpoints. Commercial teams wanted a policy interpretation and customers wanted every dashboard. I refused to weaken evidence and scheduled dashboards after compliance. A load rehearsal exposed storage latency, so I introduced tiered retention and reduced pilot volume before release. Before closing the action, I sampled performance across different shifts and demand conditions, so the result did not depend on one unusually experienced team or a quiet operating window. I translated the outcome into a simple frontline mechanism with a named owner, an escalation threshold, and a weekly measure, which made the change repeatable after I stepped away. I also documented the operating assumptions, named the owner for each follow-up action, and set a clear review date so that temporary controls could not quietly become permanent. I wrote the decision, assumptions, owners, and stop conditions on a 1-page control plan so the next shift could challenge the logic rather than rely on verbal context. I used both a leading indicator and a customer outcome measure that prevented a short-term productivity improvement from hiding quality, safety, or backlog age. During implementation, I stayed at the operating point for the first cycle, asked frontline employees what the mechanism missed, and changed only one variable at a time. I assigned named owners for each checkpoint and made escalation thresholds visible in the shift huddle, which reduced ambiguity when I was not physically present. After stabilization, I compared the result with the original baseline, checked for cost or defect displacement, and documented the mechanism for the other shifts. Before committing, I asked a supervisor who disagreed with me to identify the weakest assumption, then converted that concern into a measurable checkpoint rather than relying on consensus. I separated mandatory controls from preferences, which let the team move quickly without weakening the safety, quality, or customer promise that the operation existed to protect. For each alternative, I estimated the likely customer impact, labor requirement, operational reversibility, and worst credible failure, and I explained why my chosen path offered the best balance. I briefed affected teams before launch, checked understanding through questions rather than attendance, and made the escalation route clear to people working outside my shift. I also protected normal operations by defining which work would pause, which work would continue, and who could authorize expansion beyond the initial controlled scope. At every review point, I compared actual performance with the assumption that justified the decision. When they diverged, I changed the plan rather than defending the original recommendation. I made the cost of the choice visible as well as the benefit, because hiding overtime, rework, or displaced backlog would have made the result look stronger but less useful. Once the immediate issue was resolved, I held a short review with frontline representatives and partner teams, captured what failed in the original mechanism, and assigned permanent actions. The follow-up remained on my weekly operating review until the control had an owner, an auditable measure, and enough stable data to show the improvement was sustained. That discipline helped distinguish correlation from causation. I looked for the expected change at the affected process step before crediting the intervention for the overall outcome. I also validated the product decision with a second customer or operating cohort, asked a skeptical partner to challenge the weakest assumption, and converted the concern into an observable checkpoint, named owner, and explicit rollback threshold before recommending wider adoption. The product met the deadline, processed 14 million compliant events with no critical finding, and delivered deferred dashboards 3 weeks later. Under deadline pressure, I protect the non-negotiable customer and regulatory outcome, make sacrifices explicit, and assign owners and dates to deferred value.